This inflation stuff's getting out of control. Who's responsible for all this? Me? The government? No, I don't accept that. No, your one job, everything you have, your one job now is to figure out who we can blame for this. Come up with something catchy so that people get it stuck in their head and they can't think of anything else. Blame someone or something else.
Welcome back, you intelligent 17,000 subscribers. I really appreciate you. And those of you showing up every time, I can't thank you enough. So, inflation. You've heard of it? It's a big problem, right? And there's a lot of finger pointing. So, who's right? What's actually going on here? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the most recent CPI print, reading an 8.5% year-over-year increase. If you watched my videos from the past, I'm sure that news did not come as a surprise to you. And hopefully you were well positioned to profit from it. Or at the very least, you've been insulated from the issue by heeding some of my warnings. And if you're new here, well, welcome. This video will get you up to speed as to what exactly is going on with inflation. And then you'll probably want to check out the other videos I'll cite throughout. And I'll link out to them in the description. But it's not until you understand what's causing our current precarious situation that you can even hope to come up with the best strategy to combat it, right? So anyway, that 8.5% print, that's the highest in 40 years, as you'll hear reported in the mainstream media and from many YouTubers. But remember, you know better. The way they report this number is very different from how it was reported 40 years ago. So it's really not a fair comparison. If you want to understand all the details behind the changes the Bureau of Labor Statistics made, you really should check out this video that I'll link out to directly at the end. In short, today they use hedonics, substitution, and owner's equivalent rent, all of which have the effect of making this number today smaller than it would be had they not changed their methodology. Again, if you don't believe me, that's fine. Be sure to check out that video where we explore documents from the BLS, from the government, addressing those changes. And it makes a big difference. Take the last one, for example, owner's equivalent rent. It's probably the most obvious difference here in this case. I mean, in March, they said shelter is up only 5% year over year. And this shelter figure is important, as it makes up more than 30% of the total CPI calculation. 5%? Really? As I explained in that short I put out a couple of weeks ago, rising home prices coupled with rising mortgage rates have actually led to a mortgage payment increase for new home buyers of more than 55% year over year. That's insane. And even though I'm not suggesting the shelter number should be 55%, the government's 5% is clearly understating the real problem here. Maybe instead we should look at actual rental rates. According to Apartment List's National Rent Report, year-over-year rent growth is up a staggering 17.1%. And just for fun, if you changed the government-reported shelter number from 5% to our low-end number here of 17%, the overarching CPI would jump to more than 12%. At 55%, you don't want to know. Add back those adjustments from substitution and hedonics, and it's not crazy to think that we're experiencing inflation like never before, even higher than that 15% or so CPI calculated in 1980. And this isn't just an, oh, hey, we're making up for lost ground here post-pandemic. We've actually surpassed the pre-pandemic trend for rental rates at this point. Check this out. This is not surprising in the least, given the unprecedented amount of money that has been pumped into our supply over the last couple of years. It's the reason I made that video helping you read between the lines of the government's CPI figure and the media's spin of that data, to help you understand what's really going on, how precarious the situation really is, and how you can profit from it. And this isn't an isolated issue. It's not just the cost of housing that we're seeing skyrocket. It's pretty much everything. Check out this breakdown from Bloomberg of the CPI changes over the years. It's not just goods due to supply chain issues like some people will like to point to. It's not just energy, due to Putin. The government wants a scapegoat. They would love to blame anybody or anything other than their own bad policy decisions or the Fed's policy of kicking the can down the road. Unfortunately, that seems to be politics 101. They can't admit when they might have been wrong. It's sad, but that just seems to be how our political reality is right now. So we just have to be aware of that and not buy into any of the BS they're trying to feed us to distract us from the real culprits. I'd love to know whose job it is in the government to come up with the catchy little alliterative phrases that they hope will catch on to distract you and me from the real issues. For example, from the perspective of trying to be able to blame someone else for an inflation problem that has come from their policy decisions and the Fed's actions, the government was quick to try to rebrand inflation as the Putin price hike. It's catchy, and no doubt the war in Ukraine is exacerbating our inflation problems worldwide, especially food and energy, considering the exports that come from those countries. But it's also laughable. Our problems absolutely existed before. Let's take a look at that Putin price hike, shall we? Russia invaded Ukraine toward the beginning of 2022. Inflation, as measured by the government's own CPI, has been screaming ever higher for more than a year prior to that. So it's not just a supply chain issue because the price of pretty much everything individually is climbing at a relatively alarming rate, not just those goods affected by the supply chain. And it's even more obvious that it's not a Putin problem. Man, I wish they didn't act like we were that stupid. The final major scapegoat I've heard thrown around by politicians is corporate greed. That's a good one, a popular political buzzword. Elizabeth Warren tweeted, "Everyone is talking about inflation, and giant corporations have figured out that's an opportunity to not only pass along their own costs, but also do some price gouging to pad their profits." First of all, corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. Right or wrong, the idea is to maximize profits. That being said, there are some natural market controls that keep prices from getting out of hand. For example, Bernie Sanders blames the rising cost of a Wendy's Frosty on corporate greed. And maybe, probably, there is some of that going on. There is always some of that going on. It's true that corporations are always trying to maximize their profits and their value for shareholders. Yes, but nobody needs a Wendy's Frosty. And certainly nobody's entitled to a Wendy's Frosty. And if the price of the Frosty gets too expensive for you, you should not buy one. And if enough people stop buying their Frosties because they're too expensive, well, Wendy's will either have to lower the price if they can, if their margins will allow for that, or if it's gotten too expensive for them to make it at a price that people will buy it for, they'll discontinue it. That's how our free market works. And it's not like Wendy's has a monopoly on fast food. There are plenty of competitors in that same space, all equally greedy. So if they saw an opportunity to steal business from Wendy's because they were charging too much for their Frosty, well, you better bet they do everything they could to get those customers. If, instead, all the fast food companies were able to increase their prices at the same time, and that's not really leading to less customers, that would almost imply that all their customers just have more money. More money competing for the same goods. And don't worry, we'll circle back to that concept in a second. It can be a little bit confusing. But if you want to argue that prices aren't going up for businesses at the same rate as they are for consumers, you should probably check with the government reported Producer Price Index, or PPI. It's been skyrocketing similar to the CPI. And I only say similar in that it too has been shooting almost straight up. But where it's not the same is that it's actually been going up by more than the consumer inflation figure. And today, the gap between the two is larger than it has ever been since they started recording this back in 2009. This PPI figure is effectively inflation as experienced by businesses. It's their rising cost of goods, the rising cost of their inputs. If companies were really gouging or profiteering, these lines would, at the very least, be flipped. Say, for example, if the red line, the PPI here, were flat, still around 2.5% or so, but the CPI, the blue line, was shooting up like it is, sure, yeah, then you definitely have more of a case. If the costs of running a business have stayed the same, yet consumer prices keep soaring across the board, yeah, it very well may be that corporations are just taking advantage of inflation fears. But that's clearly not the case here. In fact, in 2021, it looks as though large corporations may have bought into the official narrative, or at least hoped, that inflation was transitory. Because that's when the gap between their costs and consumer costs really expanded. Put yourself in the position of a corporate CEO. If you raise prices and your competitors don't, perhaps because inflation really is transitory, You look bad. Some of your customers will get angry and turn to your competitors. If Wendy's is raising their rates, but McDonald's is not, they will lose some business. On top of all that, you better bet the politicians, needing something to rant about, will call you out for taking advantage of the transitory inflation and only making the problem worse. You see, you have a lot of incentive to not do that, to not risk that negative press, to not risk losing your customers, to keep your customers happy. And if that inflation you were experiencing actually turned out to be transitory, then sure, you could eat that added expense for a quarter or two. That seems to be a more likely story of what's happened here, given this data we have in front of us, from the government. Unless, to be fair, you want to argue that the CPI is being manipulated, suppressed, not showing us how bad it really is, then yeah, maybe that blue line should be way out ahead of the red one here, which would tell a different story. Man, wouldn't it be nice if we just had clean, straightforward data so that we could piece together the full story instead of all these behind-the-scenes machinations? Regardless, they're obviously both going up dramatically. The inflation is obviously real for both consumers and businesses. And it's clearly, at least not all, due to corporate greed. So it's not our supply chain causing all our inflation problems. It's not Putin. It's not corporate greed. Those are all playing their part in the equation, sure. But I believe they're far from the primary contributor to our problem today. And I'm sure all of you, at least regular viewers, already know who the real culprit is. We have been pumping an unprecedented amount of money into our country's money supply. In fact, 80% of all the currency in US dollars that has ever been created was created since the start of the pandemic. That's not that long ago. We flooded our system with cash despite warnings from people of the Austrian economic persuasion who could see the writing on the wall. Instead, The Economist, of all publications, had the nerve to claim that this was the inflation that no economist saw coming. I mean, I'm a nobody in this space, here with my brilliant 17,000 subscribers, but I've been warning about this for a while, making videos about how to profit from it, and definitely talking to my clients individually since early pandemic days about how they could position themselves for this inevitable inflation. And there were absolutely people with audiences way larger than mine sounding the alarm. Sorry, this stuff is frustrating. The politics, the media, it's also infuriating. I get worked up. I want to help. And I was thinking about this. How can I make this clear? That just throwing money at a problem is only a short-term fix and will cause worse, especially inflationary problems in the future. You know, Milton Friedman posits his quantity theory of money, which is what people are pointing to when they say that more money chasing the same basket of goods will make the prices of those goods go up. But as I try to really conceptualize that myself, I've heard a lot of analogies that just don't do it for me. You know, maybe you've heard this one. You have 10 people in a room, they all have $100, they're all buying the same goods. All of a sudden you give them another $100, so a 100% increase in the money supply. But now the price of all the goods would go up, effectively cutting the value of their money in half, leaving them in relatively the same place they started. But that doesn't quite do it for me. I know an analogy needs to be simplified so that we can better conceptualize the point, but I feel like I could do better for you here. I'm going to give it a shot. Let me know what you think. Here's my simplified version of a big reason why when you just give everyone money, it can easily result in all the money just being worth less. In other words, inflation. Here it is. Say, for example, you have an economy that's made up of 5 people. Person 1 has $100, person 2 has $80, 3 has $60, 4 has $40, and finally, the last person, person 5, has $20. There is this one widget that everyone wants, but the manufacturer, for whatever reason, only has 3. Now, for this example, let's ignore his costs. That is, of course, a very important factor here, as previously discussed, but we don't need it right now to understand this concept. If you're the manufacturer and you want to sell all your widgets, that's why you made them, to sell them and profit from them, and so you want to maximize your revenues, at what price should you set the 3 widgets? Well, if You price it at $20, you're going to have all 5 people in the economy fighting for it. Think Black Friday, pounding on your door, trampling each other, maybe even the wealthier ones, if they really wanted it, shouting higher bids as far as what they're willing to pay you to get it. And so maybe in the end, you wisely, ultimately, settle on $60 anyway. $60 was the right answer, if you had to sell them all at the same price at the same time. So person 4 and 5 just didn't have enough to outbid the other interested buyers. Wait, so what happens if we bring the money printer into the equation? We give them all an extra $40. Now they all have enough to buy that $60 widget, right? Well, no. If you, the manufacturer, weren't savvy enough to adjust your price up by $40 ahead of time, the same chaotic scene is going to play out, where person 4 and 5 just can't keep up with the bidding, and once all the dust settles, the new price of these highly sought after, rare widgets is now $100, exactly $40 higher than it was before. I know there are so many more variables here, so many, than I'm illustrating in this simplified scenario, but I did think it does a better job at illustrating why, one, just giving people money may not necessarily result in guaranteeing that they'll be able to buy what they might have been able to before you just gave everyone money. And two, in the same vein, that pumping more and more money into the system can easily have the effect of increasing prices all around. In fact, if we were exploring this analogy further and including the cost of making the widget, those costs would likely go up as well. Since the same sort of market-based, all that bidding that took place in the example, that same sort of market-based system would take place with the raw materials, with the inputs, the cost of goods sold. If that's the case, if it's more expensive for the manufacturer to make it, maybe it's not crazy to consider that perhaps selling the widget at $60 is no longer even profitable for the manufacturer, and that their price hike to $100 could have even kept their margins the exact same. And maybe we should flesh this all out a little bit further. I'm just spitballing here at this point. Let me know what you think. At least say hey in the comments. This video is going to help you understand all those CPI adjustments I was talking about at the top of the video. I look forward to seeing you around. Take care.